It's not fair to anybody, to her friends. It's not fair. She was 21 years old. 21. Like she...
On July 5th, 2026, 21-year-old Arianna Bailey Jones left her Glendale, Arizona, apartment to meet a man she had connected with online. The plan appeared ordinary: a first meeting, a movie, and then home. But Arianna never returned. 2 days later, her family reported her missing. Her phone was still at her apartment. Her dog was left behind, and investigators began tracing the final movements of the woman who had suddenly disappeared. What they uncovered led them away from Glendale and toward a remote area near Lake Pleasant, where a series of clues began connecting Arianna's final hours to the man she had met that day. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, one question became increasingly difficult to ignore: what happened after the movie? The answer turns a missing person investigation into a murder case and place one man at the center of it. This is the story of Arianna Bailey Jones. Hello, and welcome to Only Crime Stories. Before we continue, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a new case. Before Arianna Bailey Jones became the subject of a homicide investigation, she was a 21-year-old woman building a life around the people closest to her. She lived in Glendale, Arizona, and was raising a young child. Family was an important part of her daily life, and the routine surrounding her child gave the people around her a clear picture of what was normal for Arianna. She stayed connected with relatives, maintained regular communication, and continued working toward the future she wanted for herself and her child. Arianna also had ambitions beyond motherhood. She was described as a stylist with plans for her career, giving her another direction she was actively pursuing. At 21, her life was still taking shape. There were responsibilities to manage, goals to pursue, and a future that had not yet been defined. Her family knew her routines well enough to recognize when something was different. That became important in early July 2026. Arianna had been communicating online with a 24-year-old man named Dominic Scott Glenn Rodolico. Their contact had developed through social media, and on July 5th, the two arranged to meet in person. For Arianna, this was not described as a long-established relationship. It was a meeting with someone she had come to know online. That afternoon, she was at her Glendale apartment. Later, Rodolico arrived to pick her up. The plan appeared simple. They would spend some time together and go to a movie. Nothing about those first reported movements immediately suggested that this would be Arianna's final day. But the significance of that meeting became clear afterward. Because once Arianna left her apartment on July 5th, the ordinary timeline of her day began to change. And the people who knew her would soon realize that she had not simply gone somewhere and failed to come home. They were about to retrace the final hours of her life.
She was last seen going to the movies with this man, 23-year-old Dominic Rodolico. On Saturday, her remains were found in a shallow grave near Lake Pleasant. Rodolico is now charged with first-degree murder. He's being held on a $2 million bond. And tonight we are hearing from Arianna's mother, who again reported her missing.
She spent all of last week searching for her daughter and told our Molly McBride this is not the ending that she had imagined.
It's not fair. It's not fair at all to her, to me, to her son, to her brothers and her sisters. It's not fair to anybody, to her friends. It's not fair. She was 21 years old. 21. Like she...
Arianna Jones's mother, Sophia Sardinas, overcome with grief.
And I'm so sorry that this happened to her, because this was not supposed to happen to her.
She wanted to tell everybody about Arianna, that she loved being a mom to her 2-year-old son.
She needed to come home to her son. She needed to come back to her baby and me.
And that she hadn't had the easiest childhood. She says Arianna was adopted when she was 3 and bounced around from house to house. The two were reunited when Arianna was 18, and she had big plans for her future.
She wanted to have a family. That's all she wanted. And for this guy to take her life from her like that?
Sophia reported Arianna missing July 7th. She says she stopped responding to her calls or texts. When she went to her daughter's apartment to check it out, her fears were confirmed.
I felt this heavy feeling, like I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like something happened, something was wrong with my baby.
Sophia spent the week searching, handing out flyers and holding onto hope. until she got the horrific news that Arianna wasn't coming home.
She just wanted to, go out to the movies. She just wanted to watch a movie.
When her daughter disappeared, Sophia was watching her young son. She believes Arianna fought hard to get back to him.
I know my daughter, and she would not just let somebody do that to her and not fight back to get to her son.
Sophia says she would trade places with her daughter in an instant.
I would die for her. I don't care. She deserves to be here.
On July 5th, the plan was straightforward. Arianna was going to meet Dominic Scott Glenn Rodolico, a man she had previously communicated with through social media. According to investigators, the two had arranged to meet in person that day. Rodolico arrived at Arianna's Glendale apartment and picked her up. From there, their movements began appearing on surveillance systems that would later become important to the investigation. The first destination was a movie theater. At this point in the timeline, there was nothing publicly reported suggesting that the evening had immediately become a confrontation. Surveillance footage reportedly showed Arianna and Rodolico together at the theater, providing investigators with a documented starting point for reconstructing what happened afterward. But the movie was not the end of their movements. Investigators later examined cell phone data, surveillance footage, and vehicle information to determine where the two went after leaving the theater. That evidence would eventually establish a route away from the populated areas of Glendale. The destination was an isolated area near Lake Pleasant. That location would become one of the most important places in the entire investigation. According to investigators, Rodolico had been in the remote area earlier that same day, before picking Arianna up. The significance of that earlier visit became apparent after police began examining the sequence of events surrounding her disappearance. By the end of July 5th, Arianna was no longer communicating with the people who normally expected to hear from her. At first, there was no immediate explanation. She had left for an outing, and there was no clear indication to her family that something had gone wrong. But as the hours passed, the absence became increasingly unusual. Arianna's phone was still at her Glendale apartment. Her wallet was reportedly missing, while other details inside the residence suggested that she had not simply left with the intention of disappearing for an extended period. Her dog was also still there, confined inside a kennel. Investigators later reported that the animal had been left without food or water. Then there was another break in Arianna's normal routine. Her regular communication with her family stopped. The calls and contact involving her young child were no longer happening. For relatives who knew her habits, the change was significant. By July 7th, the family had gone beyond waiting for her to return. A relative contacted Glendale police and reported Arianna missing. Detectives now had to establish exactly where she had gone, who she had been with, and what had happened after she left home 2 days earlier. The investigation began with the apartment. Officers examined what Arianna had left behind and started gathering information about her final known activities. A friend provided investigators with an important detail. Arianna had planned to meet someone for a movie. That information gave police their first clear direction. They now had a name to investigate, a vehicle to trace, and a timeline that could potentially be reconstructed through technology. Once Arianna was officially reported missing, investigators began working backward through the final known hours of her life. The information from her family gave detectives a starting point, but it was the available technology that began filling in the gaps. Investigators examined cell phone records and surveillance footage to establish who Arianna had been with and where she had traveled. They also reviewed vehicle information and automated license plate reader data, creating a timeline from multiple independent sources. The name that repeatedly appeared was Dominic Rodolico. Detectives determined that Rodolico had picked Arianna up from her apartment and that the two had gone to a movie theater. Surveillance footage reportedly captured them together, providing investigators with visual confirmation of the meeting. The investigation then moved beyond the theater. Cell phone and vehicle data reportedly placed the pair traveling toward the Lake Pleasant area. This was significant because the location was remote and far removed from the ordinary places associated with Arianna's day-to-day life. But detectives found another detail that changed how they viewed the timeline. According to information described in the investigation, Rodolico had traveled to the same remote area earlier on July 5th, before he picked Arianna up. Investigators reportedly determined that he remained there for roughly 25 minutes. With the investigation pointing toward the Lake Pleasant area, detectives began focusing their attention on the remote desert terrain. The location presented a different challenge from the Glendale apartment and the movie theater. This was an undeveloped area, separated from the places Arianna had been seen earlier that day. Investigators had to determine whether anything connected to her disappearance could be found there. Search teams were brought into the area, and investigators used additional resources to examine the surrounding terrain. Among those resources were cadaver dogs, which can help locate human remains even when they are concealed underground. The search continued until July 11th. That day, investigators discovered a shallow grave containing human remains. The discovery immediately changed the direction of the case. What had begun as a missing person investigation was now being treated as a homicide. Police said the remains were believed to be those of Arianna, although early reporting indicated that formal identification and medical examiner procedures were still being completed. The location also contained items that investigators considered potentially significant. Among the reported discoveries were clothing and personal items, along with 2 Harkins movie souvenir cups. Other materials found in or around the area reportedly included latex gloves, concrete-related materials, and other potential evidence. The movie cups were particularly notable because investigators had already established that Arianna and Rodolico had gone to a Harkins theater earlier that day. As investigators processed the discovery near Lake Pleasant, their attention remained focused on Dominic Scott Glenn Rodolico. The connection was not based on a single piece of information. Detectives had already established that Rodolico was the person who had been with Arianna during her final known outing. They also had surveillance, cell phone information, and vehicle data that placed him along the route investigators were examining. Now, the physical evidence from the desert gave detectives another part of the timeline to evaluate. Rodolico was 24 years old and lived in the Peoria area. His background also became part of the investigation. According to court records, Rodolico had a prior criminal history. In November 2025, he reportedly received 2 years of supervised probation after pleading guilty in a case involving thefts from Quick Trip locations. He had also been convicted of criminal impersonation. Those previous cases did not establish what happened to Arianna, but they provided investigators with additional information about the suspect's history. Then detectives learned about something else. Rodolico had reportedly appeared with injuries shortly after the disappearance. According to court documents described in subsequent reporting, his mother saw him on the morning of July 6th and noticed several lacerations on his right hand. Rodolico reportedly provided an explanation for those injuries. He told his mother that he had been attacked. That statement would become important because it introduced an entirely different version of what investigators believe had happened during Arianna's final hours. According to Rodolico, the injuries were connected to an encounter involving other people. When investigators began questioning Rodolico about the events of July 5th, he provided an explanation for what had happened in the remote area. According to accounts described in court documents, Rodolico said he and Arianna had been confronted by 2 unknown men. He claimed the men were armed and that an attack followed. Rodolico said he was injured during the encounter. He also claimed that Arianna had been stabbed. This explanation became a central part of the investigation because it presented a completely different sequence of events from the one detectives were developing through physical and digital evidence. If Rodolico's account were accurate, investigators would need to determine who these 2 men were, why they had approached the pair, and what had happened after the alleged attack. But detectives reportedly found problems with the story. According to investigators, Rodolico did not immediately contact police to report an attack. There was number 911 call from him describing what had supposedly happened to Arianna. His accounts also reportedly changed during questioning, with investigators describing differences between versions of the incident. The injuries to his hand were another issue detectives examined. Rodolico had reportedly told his mother that he had been attacked, but investigators were trying to determine whether those injuries were consistent with the explanation he provided. At the same time, detectives were examining the physical evidence recovered from the burial site and comparing it with the established timeline. As detectives continued reconstructing July 5th, one detail began to stand apart from the rest of the timeline. According to the investigation described in court documents, Rodolico had allegedly traveled to the remote Lake Pleasant area before he went to Arianna's apartment. The timing mattered. Investigators reportedly determined that he arrived in the isolated area and remained there for approximately 25 minutes. He then left the location and later went to pick Arianna up. At the time of that earlier visit, Arianna had not yet joined him. That sequence became one of the most significant questions in the case. Why had Rodolico gone to such a remote location before meeting Arianna? There was no publicly established explanation that resolved that question. Investigators then compared the earlier visit with what happened later in the day. After the movie, Rodolico and Arianna were reportedly tracked back toward the same general area. The connection gave detectives a chronological pattern: an initial visit by Rodolico, the pickup of Arianna, the movie, and then a return toward the isolated location. But the discovery of the shallow grave made the timing more significant. If the location had been visited before Arianna was picked up, investigators had to consider whether the trip was simply unrelated or whether it formed part of a larger plan. By this point, investigators were no longer working with a single clue. They were assembling separate pieces of evidence into one timeline. At the Lake Pleasant site, detectives had recovered items they believed could connect the location to Arianna's final outing. Among them were 2 Harkins movie cups, along with clothing and other materials found near the burial area. Investigators also reported recovering latex gloves, concrete-related materials, and other potential evidence from the site. Each item required forensic examination. The presence of an object alone did not establish who had used it or exactly when it had been placed there. Detectives therefore had to compare the physical findings with the digital timeline and information obtained during interviews. At the same time, Rodolico's movements were being examined alongside his statements. The earlier trip to the remote location remained significant because it occurred before he picked Arianna up. His later return to the area created a sequence investigators believed was difficult to dismiss. By July 11th, investigators had developed enough evidence to take the case into a new phase. The same day authorities located the human remains near Lake Pleasant, Rodolico was taken into custody. According to reports, officers arrested him while he was cleaning the rear portion of his vehicle. Investigators also observed an injury to his hand, adding another detail to the timeline they had been examining since the disappearance. Rodolico was subsequently booked on a first-degree murder allegation. A separate charge relating to the concealment or abandonment of a dead body was also reported. The arrest followed several days of investigation that had begun with a missing person report and expanded into a homicide case. For detectives, the case now centered on whether the evidence could establish what happened to Arianna and whether Rodolico was responsible. The prosecution's theory relies on more than the fact that he had been with Arianna shortly before she disappeared. It involved his movements, the remote location, physical evidence, surveillance, cell phone information, and statements investigators said were inconsistent. With Rodolico in custody, investigators had to turn the information gathered during the search into evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. The case against him was built from several different sources rather than one decisive piece of evidence. Surveillance footage helped establish his movements with Arianna. Cell phone information provided another method of tracking the timeline. Vehicle data added further information about where he traveled on July 5th. Then there was the evidence recovered from the burial site. Investigators reported finding materials and personal items that they believed could connect the location to Arianna and to the events surrounding her disappearance. Those findings became part of the broader investigation into how she reached the remote area and what happened there. Rodolico's statements also became relevant. Detectives had his account involving 2 unknown attackers, but investigators reportedly identified inconsistencies between different versions of that explanation. His failure to report the alleged attack was another issue prosecutors could examine. While investigators were building the case, Arianna's family was dealing with a different reality. The search for her had ended. Her mother, Sofia Sardinas, had been among those trying to determine where Arianna was after communication suddenly stopped. The family had provided information to investigators and helped establish the routines that made her disappearance unusual. Arianna's young child remained an important part of the family's experience during the investigation. Before her disappearance, Arianna had maintained regular contact with relatives, including communication involving her child. That routine had stopped, adding to the family's concerns. After investigators discovered the remains near Lake Pleasant, the family's role changed from helping locate Arianna to confronting the investigation into her death. Public statements from relatives focused on Arianna's life, her role as a mother, and the future she had been working toward. A fundraising campaign was also established to assist the family following her death. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation continued moving forward. Detectives had a timeline. They had a location. They had physical and digital evidence. And they had a defendant who disputed the investigators' interpretation of what happened. But the evidence still had to be tested through the legal system. After Rodolico's arrest, the investigation moved into its next stage, the criminal court process. He was formally accused of first-degree premeditated murder in connection with Arianna's death. He also faced a separate allegation related to the concealment or abandonment of a dead body. The charges reflected the prosecution's position that Arianna's death was not simply the result of an unexplained confrontation, but part of a deliberate act. That interpretation would ultimately have to be supported by evidence presented through the legal process. Rodolico remained in custody under a reported $2 million cash bond. A status hearing was scheduled for July 17th, giving the court an opportunity to address the case as prosecutors continued moving forward with the allegations. At this stage, the distinction between an accusation and a conviction was essential. Rodolico had been arrested and charged, but the charges themselves did not establish guilt. The prosecution would have to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That meant the evidence gathered during the investigation would come under greater scrutiny. The surveillance footage, the cell phone records, the movements to Lake Pleasant, the physical evidence recovered from the burial site, and Rodolico's explanation involving two unknown attackers. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more true crime stories. See you in the next case.